She doesn't speak at this table, Vivian Caruso hissed, just as Clara Whitaker leaned towards Salvatore Bellomo with a crystal glass of red wine trembling on her tray. The plus-sized waitress was supposed to lower her eyes, accept the insult, and disappear behind the black-suited guards surrounding the Sicilian father of Chicago's most feared mafia boss. Instead, Clara greeted the old man in a dialect so ancient and intimate that Salvatore stopped breathing. His wine froze halfway to his mouth, and Alessio Bellomo's entire empire seemed to hold its breath. The ballroom went silent under the chandeliers. Forks hovered above porcelain plates. A violinist missed a note. Men who had ordered executions with less emotion than ordering espresso turned their heads toward the soft, heavy woman in the black and white waitress uniform standing at the edge of the Bellomo family table. Clara's cheeks burned, but she did not step back. She stood there with both hands wrapped around the tray, her broad shoulders steady, her body taking up the space everyone in that room had silently demanded she surrender. Vivian's painted mouth fell open first. Then Marco Rinaldi's fingers tightened around his napkin. Then Alessio Bellomo, seated at his father's right hand in a tailored black suit, lifted his eyes from the silver knife beside his plate and looked at Clara as if she had just done something more dangerous than insult king. No one moved, not even the bodyguards. Salvatore Bellomo was 72 years old, carved down by Sicily, Chicago, prison, grief, and power. He had watched men beg. He had watched sons betray fathers. He had watched blood washed from marble before dessert. But this waitress had just spoken to him in a voice that did not belong in a Chicago ballroom. Not because it was wrong, because it was too right. Clara felt every stare land on her body like a hand. The rich wives in satin, the underbosses with diamond watches, the waitstaff frozen near the velvet ropes, terrified one of their own had broken an invisible law. She knew what they saw, a very large white woman in a cheap uniform, soft where they worshipped sharpness, working class where they worshipped bloodlines, visible only because she had made herself impossible to ignore. Her pulse hammered, but her chin stayed lifted. She had not meant to challenge anyone. She had only heard the old man's hand shake against the stem of his glass, heard the ritual phrase spoken incorrectly by someone at the table, and answered with the greeting she had been taught never to waste on strangers. Alessio said nothing. That was worse than anger. His silence moved through the room like a locked door closing. One guard shifted his hand toward his jacket. Another blocked the path back to the kitchen. Vivian recovered enough to whisper, "She's just staff." But Salvatore still had not lowered the glass. The red wine shivered against the crystal rim. Then the old patriarch slowly turned the glass in his fingers, staring not at Clara's uniform, not at her body, not at the tray, but at her mouth, as if the next word she spoke might resurrect a buried Sicilian ghost. The wine in Salvatore Bellomo's crystal glass still had not touched his mouth, and that impossible pause made the insult hanging over Clara even sharper. "She's just staff." Vivian's whisper slid across the white marble ballroom like a knife dressed in perfume. Alessio Bellomo remained silent at his father's right hand, but his silence was no longer empty. It had weight now, a cold pressure that made the bodyguards watch Clara instead of the exits. Clara felt the tray cut into her palms. She could feel every stare measuring her size, her uniform, her place. And still, beneath the heat in her face, one thought held steady. They had all been speaking too loudly in front of someone they believed could not understand. 2 hours earlier, no one in that ballroom had cared whether Clara Whitaker had a voice. She had stood behind the service doors with 30 other temporary staff, smoothing the white apron over her soft, heavy body while the event captain inspected them like silverware. "Bellomo table gets perfection," he snapped. "No spills, no questions, no conversation unless spoken to. And for God's sake, stay out of the photographs." His eyes lingered on Clara half a second longer than everyone else, enough to make 2 servers behind her exchange a smirk. Clara did not look down. She tied her apron tighter, lifted the first tray of crystal glasses, and stepped into the light. Work had taught her how to survive rooms that wanted her smaller. Her feet knew how to balance on polished marble after 12-hour shifts. Her wrists knew the weight of wine bottles, porcelain plates, and men's impatience. Her ears knew the difference between a joke meant to wound and a whisper meant to hide. People saw her body first, then her uniform, then nothing at all. That invisibility had paid her rent, but it had also become an education. Clara remembered every seat at every table. She remembered who asked for mineral water but drank whiskey when his wife turned away. She remembered which capo kissed Vivian Caruso's hand too long. She remembered Marco Rinaldi correcting a waiter's pronunciation with the confidence of a man performing heritage instead of living it. Near the Bellomo table, she had bent to replace a napkin Salvatore had dropped before anyone important noticed. His fingers had brushed the stem of the crystal glass, not weak, but careful, as if the glass carried memory heavier than wine. Under his breath, the old man had murmured a Sicilian blessing, so old Clara had not heard it since the woman in the third-floor walk-up who used to pay her, in soup and language. Clara had almost answered then. She stopped herself. Waitresses did not answer ghosts. Then Vivian arrived in ivory satin and diamonds sharp enough to draw blood. She smiled at Clara without seeing her. "Stand behind the rope, sweetheart. These seats are for family." Clara stepped back because rent was due, because dignity did not always look like defiance, because surviving sometimes meant swallowing the first cut. But when Marco leaned toward Salvatore later and repeated the ritual phrase wrong, one syllable twisted just enough to turn respect into mockery, Clara's hand tightened around the tray. Back in the frozen ballroom, she understood why the old man's eyes had changed. A black-suited guard moved behind her, blocking the service door. Alessio finally lifted one finger from the table. "Bring the tray," he said, his voice quiet enough to terrify the room. "And bring her. Bring the tray. And bring her." Alessio Bellomo did not raise his voice, but the order moved through the ballroom faster than shouting. The guard behind Clara stepped aside only enough to make the path narrower, forcing her toward the Bellomo table with the crystal glasses balanced in her aching hands. The service door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Clara felt it like a lock sliding into place. She was no longer staff moving through a party. She was a woman being brought before a crime family, under chandeliers bright enough to expose every tremor she refused to show. Alessio watched her cross the marble floor without blinking. He was younger than his father, but the room bent around him in a different way. Salvatore carried old power, buried power, the kind that smelled like tobacco, church stone, and blood promises made before most men at the table were born. Alessio carried the current kind. Black SUVs waiting outside. Contracts signed by terrified businessmen. Restaurant fronts that never lost money. Judges who returned his calls before their wives did. 2 bodyguards stood behind his chair, but the true warning was that neither man looked nervous. They trusted him to decide how dangerous Clara was. Clara stopped beside the table. The tray had grown heavy enough to numb her fingers, but she did not set it down without permission. That was the first thing Alessio noticed. Not fear, not obedience exactly. Control. Her round face was flushed from humiliation. Her white apron strained slightly where the tray pressed against her waist, her shoulders broad and steady beneath the cheap uniform. Everyone else saw a waitress who had stepped above her station. Alessio saw a woman who knew she was standing in front of wolves and still remembered how not to drop the glass. "Name," he said. "Clara Whitaker." Her voice was quiet, but it did not break. A murmur moved along the table. Vivian Caruso's diamond bracelet clicked against her champagne flute. Marco Rinaldi leaned back, studying Clara with the irritated focus of a man discovering a locked door in a hallway he owned. Salvatore still held the crystal glass. Red wine trembled near the rim, untouched. On the old man's right hand, the Bellomo signet ring caught the chandelier light, a dark oval of gold and bloodline pressed into skin. Alessio tapped one finger against the table once. The murmur died. "You understood my father." It was not a question. Clara looked at Salvatore, then back to Alessio. Every instinct told her to make herself smaller, softer, harmless. But shrinking had never protected her. It had only made cruel people more comfortable. "Understood the words," she said. Not what he meant by them. Something shifted in Alessio's eyes. Not trust, not warmth. Attention sharpened into a blade. And Marco? The name landed like a coin, dropped into a deep well. Marco's smile appeared too quickly. Alessio, she's a banquet waitress. She probably heard a phrase on television and got lucky. Vivian gave a light laugh, pretty and poisonous. Or maybe she's been listening where she doesn't belong. Clara kept both hands on the tray. The crystal stems chimed once, small and bright. Alessio heard it. So did Salvatore. "Nobody asked you," Alessio said, without looking at Vivian. The words emptied the air from her smile. Then he finally reached toward Clara's tray, not for the wine, but for the glass Salvatore had refused to drink from. He set it on the marble between them, beside his father's signet hand, and asked, "Tell me exactly what you heard before you greeted him." Clara opened her mouth, but Vivian stepped forward first, her voice cutting across the table. "Before she lies, perhaps someone should ask why a woman like her was hovering close enough to hear anything at all." "A woman like her?" Alessio repeated, so softly even the violinist seemed afraid to breathe over it. Vivian did not look at him. She looked at Clara, because Clara was safer to wound. "A waitress who forgets the difference between serving a table and joining it," she said, her ivory satin catching the chandelier light like polished bone. She was leaning over your father's shoulder, listening to private family words, clutching his wine like she owned the room. A few guests shifted, not laughter this time, but something worse, agreement dressed as silence. Clara felt the old heat climb her throat. She had heard versions of that sentence her entire life, in restaurants, buses, fitting rooms, church basements. Too much body, too much presence, too much nerve for someone expected to be grateful for the corner. But she kept her hands steady around the tray. The crystal stems did not rattle. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it crueler. Maybe no one taught her that Bellomo women don't hover. They're chosen. They're born to tables like this. They don't waddle up with a tray and pretend a borrowed word makes them blood. The insult landed. Several rich wives glanced away, not because they disagreed, but because they wanted the pleasure without the responsibility. One of the younger men at Marco's side smirked into his napkin. Clara's fingers tightened, but her face stayed calm. "I didn't pretend anything," she said. It was the smallest sentence in the room, and somehow it made Vivian's eyes sharpen. "Then apologize for interrupting Mr. Bellomo and go back behind the rope." Vivian reached for Salvatore's untouched glass, as if to remove evidence of Clara's offense. Clara moved first, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to place her tray beneath the glass before Vivian's manicured fingers could close around it. Red wine trembled inside the crystal. A thin drop slid down the outside and marked Clara's white apron like a wound. The room noticed. Vivian smiled. "Look at that. She can't even stand still near something expensive." A guard took one step forward. Alessio lifted 2 fingers. The guard stopped. His eyes remained on Clara now, not with rescue, but with calculation. Salvatore had not spoken since the greeting. His signet hand rested beside the glass, the gold ring dark under the chandelier, his knuckles pale. Marco Rinaldi broke the silence with an easy chuckle. "This has become sentimental over nothing. Let the girl go before she embarrasses herself further." He lifted his own glass for a toast, voice smooth, Sicilian vowels polished just enough to impress Americans who did not know better. To old blood, new alliances, and sons who remember the vow of their fathers. Clara heard it. One syllable wrong. Not mispronounced. Replaced. The phrase he used did not mean vow. It meant debt. Salvatore's signet finger twitched once against the marble. Alessio saw her eyes move. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "What did you hear?" Marco's smile hardened. Vivian whispered, "Don't you dare." Clara looked at the crystal glass staining her apron, then at the old patriarch's trembling hand, and realized the wrong word had not been an accident. Clara realized the wrong word had not been an accident before anyone else understood, there was a word to be afraid of. Marco Rinaldi's toast still hung above the Bellomo table, polished and poisonous, while the red wine on Clara's apron spread in a dark crescent beneath Salvatore's crystal glass. Vivian's warning brushed her ear like a threat. "Don't you dare." Clara dared anyway. She did not raise her voice. She did not snatch attention. She simply shifted her solid, steady body between Vivian's reaching hand and the glass, anchored both feet on the marble, and looked at the old Sicilian father as if he were the only person in the room who deserved the truth. "He didn't say vow," Clara said. The words were quiet, but they hit the table harder than broken crystal. Marco's smile held for half a second too long. "Excuse me." "In your toast," Clara continued, fingers firm around the tray. "You said debitu, not juramentu." A few men blinked. The difference meant nothing to most of them. It meant everything to Salvatore. His signet hand closed slowly into a fist. Vivian laughed too brightly. "This is absurd. She's correcting Sicilian men now." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin level. "No," she said. "I'm correcting a man who wanted your father to hear debt, while everyone else heard loyalty." The ballroom changed temperature. Not literally, but everyone felt it. The guests who had smirked at Clara's uniform stopped breathing through their smiles. The bodyguard nearest Marco moved his hand away from his jacket and toward the back of Marco's chair. Alessio did not look at Marco yet. He watched Clara, and for the first time his attention was not merely dangerous. It was exact. Marco spread his hands. A charming performance. She hears one village word and invents conspiracy. Clara slid the tray down onto the marble table with controlled care. The crystal stems chimed once. She touched the base of Salvatore's untouched glass with 2 fingers, not claiming it, only protecting it from Vivian's hand and Marco's story. Earlier, Mr. Bellomo murmured a blessing before the toast. She said, "Old form, mountain form, the kind people say when the table is family, not business." Salvatore's eyes sharpened. Clara swallowed once. The whole room seemed to press against her body, trying to force her back into silence, but she did not move. Marco answered with the trade form. Then he changed one syllable in the toast. If Mr. Bellomo accepted it, everyone here would think he accepted a debt tied to this alliance. Marco's face hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Clara looked at him then. "I know you corrected a waiter for rolling in our wrong, but you let that word stand." A low sound moved through the room. Not laughter, fear recognizing itself. Vivian's diamonds flashed as she turned to Alessio. "Are you really going to let a banquet girl insult your guests?" Alessio finally lifted one hand. Every guard in the ballroom stilled. "Nobody moves," he said. 2 words, soft as velvet over a blade. Then he took Salvatore's crystal glass from the table, set it directly in front of Clara, beside the dark shine of the Bellomo signet, and asked without warmth, without mercy, "Say the blessing again." "Exactly as my father said it." "Say the blessing again." "Exactly as my father said it." Alessio's command left no room for applause, argument, or mercy. The crystal glass sat in front of Clara like a verdict, red wine dark against the white marble, the Bellomo signet gleaming beside it on Salvatore's hand. Every person in the ballroom waited for the waitress to fail. Clara could feel Vivian's satisfaction before it reached the woman's mouth. She could feel Marco's stare sharpening, searching for the moment her nerve would collapse. But Clara looked only at Salvatore, not at his power, not at the men behind him, at the old grief in his eyes. Then she repeated the blessing in the same low dialect he had breathed over the wine, syllable for syllable, with a soft mountain weight that did not belong to textbooks, television, or restaurant menus. Salvatore's face changed so little most of the room missed it. Alessio did not. The old man's thumb pressed once against the signet ring, hard enough to whiten the skin around gold. The glass had stopped shaking. That was the detail Alessio measured, not Clara's uniform, not Vivian's outrage, not Marco's performance. The glass. His father's hand had steadied because of her voice. "Where did you learn that?" Alessio asked. Clara held the tray at her side, shoulders square despite the wine stains spreading across her apron. From Mrs. Giordano, she said. Third floor above a laundromat on Ashland. She couldn't walk down the stairs after her hip surgery, so I brought groceries after my lunch shifts. She paid me with soup, saint stories, and words nobody else wanted to remember. A flicker passed over Salvatore's face at the surname. There and gone. Marco laughed under his breath. Convenient little saint's story. Clara turned to him slowly. She also taught me that men who borrow old words usually respect them, unless they need the wrong meaning to pass unnoticed. The room absorbed that. Alessio leaned back, silent, colder than before, but the cold had changed direction. It was no longer aimed only at Clara. You heard Marco say dead, he said. Yes. You heard my father answer before that. Yes. And you waited until the glass was in someone else's hand before speaking. Clara's pulse hit once hard. It sounded like accusation. She could have lowered her eyes. Instead, she met his. I waited because I was told not to speak at your table. Then I realized silence would make me part of the lie. Something in Alessio's gaze tightened. Not softness. Recognition. A dangerous kind. Vivian stepped closer, diamonds flashing. Alessio, this is humiliating. She is turning a family dinner into a trial because she wants attention. Alessio did not look at her. No, you gave her the trial when you tried to take the glass. Vivian went pale. Marco's jaw flexed once. Too fast. Too small. Clara saw it because watching overlooked men had taught her as much as watching cruel women. Alessio saw Clara see it. That was when the first real thread of trust pulled between them. Thin as wire and twice as sharp. He lifted 2 fingers. The guards at the exits shifted. Marco's hand slid beneath the table, toward his phone. Clara noticed the movement before the nearest guard did, and Marco noticed her noticing. Marco's hand disappeared beneath the table, and Clara knew the movement was not fear. It was coordination. His thumb moved once, hidden by the white linen, and the tiny glow of his phone lit the underside of his cuff. Clara did not shout. Shouting would make her look hysterical to the people already waiting for proof that she did not belong. Instead, she stepped forward with the same steady weight she used to cross slick kitchen floors carrying 20 pounds of glass, letting the edge of her tray strike the table leg with a clean metallic ring. Every eye snapped back to her. Marco's hand froze. Alessio saw the phone light before Marco could kill it. The room did not explode. That was the terrifying part. Alessio only turned his head a fraction. 2 guards moved without instruction, one behind Marco's chair, one toward Vivian's side of the table. Hands where I can see them, Alessio said. Marco smiled, but the color had drained from his mouth. You're letting a waitress choreograph your security now? No, Alessio said. I'm letting her point out what my security missed. The words were not praise. Not yet. They were more dangerous than praise, because they gave Clara function in a room that had tried to erase her. Vivian's eyes flashed. This is insane. She bumps into a table. Here's a few village syllables. And now she's your oracle. Clara felt the old instinct to step back, to make space for a thinner, richer, louder woman's certainty. She did not obey it. Her body stayed rooted beside the Bellomo table, soft and solid and impossible to pretend away. I'm not an oracle, she said. I'm a waitress. People talk over waitresses because they think we disappear when we stop pouring. Salvatore's eyes moved to her then, sharp beneath heavy lids. Alessio stood. The scrape of his chair against marble made half the room flinch. He came around the table slowly, not touching Clara, not crowding her, only placing himself between her and Marco's nearest man. It should have felt like rescue. It felt more complicated. Protection, yes. Precision, no. Clara watched for the difference. Come with me, Alessio said. Now. The order slid through her like cold wine. Behind him, a velvet rope had been unclipped, opening the narrow path toward a private alcove screened by black curtains and guarded by 2 men with expressionless faces. Clara did not move. Am I being removed? She asked. Or, am I being heard somewhere they can't interrupt? A silence hit harder than Vivian's laugh ever could have. Alessio looked at her fully then, and for the first time the darkness in his eyes was not only threat. It was assessment forced to become respect. Heard, he said. One word. Clara nodded once and picked up Salvatore's crystal glass from the marble, not as a servant clearing a table, but as the only person in the room who understood why it mattered. She carried it with both hands, her apron stained, her chin lifted, following Alessio into the shadowed alcove while the crowd watched her pass like a verdict they had not expected. Inside, the noise of the ballroom dulled to a velvet hush. Alessio stopped close enough for her to smell expensive soap, rain on wool, and the iron discipline of a man trained never to ask for help. "You saw his phone before my men did," he said. Clara set the glass on the small black table between them. "Because no one was watching his hands. They were watching my body." His jaw tightened, but he did not apologize. "Not yet. Then watch with me." Outside the curtain, Vivian's voice rose sweetly for a new toast, and Clara heard the first Sicilian word land wrong. Outside the black curtain, Vivian Caruso began the toast in a voice polished smooth enough to hide a knife. Clara heard the first Sicilian word land wrong, then the second, and her stomach tightened before the meaning reached the rest of the room. This was not vanity. This was not a rich woman mangling old language to impress old men. Vivian was repeating a binding phrase, one used at family tables when money, marriage, and blood obligations were being folded into the same promise. Only she had changed the heart of it. She had turned guest into guarantor. She had turned alliance into ownership. If Salvatore lifted his glass to answer, the Belomos would appear to accept a debt hidden inside a blessing. Clara looked at the crystal glass on the alcove table. The red wine had gone almost black beneath the velvet shadows. Alessio saw her face change. "What?" he asked. "That word again," Clara said. "Not Marco's mistake. Hers." Alessio did not ask if she was sure. That was the first real sign he believed her enough to risk something. He pulled the curtain aside. The ballroom widened around them in white marble, gold light, and watching eyes. Vivian stood at the head of the table with her champagne raised, radiant in ivory satin, smiling as if she had already won. Marco's phone sat face down now, too innocent to be innocent. Salvatore's hand rested beside his untouched place setting. The Bellomo signet gleamed under the chandelier like a sealed verdict. "To the Bellomo family," Vivian said, "who honor old debts as if they were born from love." Clara stepped out before Alessio could speak for her. The movement made the room recoil in tiny, revealing ways. A wife lowered her glass. A couple frowned. One guard shifted as if to block her, then stopped when Alessio's eyes cut toward him. Clara felt every gaze strike her stained apron, her broad body, her cheap shoes against their marble. She let them look. She had spent her life being watched for the wrong reasons. Now she made that attention useful. "That is not the blessing," she said. Vivian turned slowly, eyes glittering. "Are you interrupting again?" "Yes." The answer was simple enough to bruise the air. Clara kept walking until she stood beside Salvatore's chair, not behind it. Because she did not say honor. She said inherit. And she did not say love. She said obligation carried through sons. Marco stood too fast. "Enough." Alessio's voice cut through him. "Sit down." Marco did not. That was his mistake. Salvatore finally moved. The old man removed the signet ring from his finger and placed it on the white marble with a quiet click. It was a small sound, but it made every armed man in the ballroom straighten. Clara understood then that the ring was not decoration. It was judgment. Vivian's smile cracked for the first time. "This waitress is twisting words to humiliate me." Clara's hands curled once at her sides, then opened. "No, I'm translating the humiliation you try to hide inside them." She turned to Salvatore, heart pounding hard enough to shake her voice if she let it. She did not let it. "If you answer that toast, they can say you accepted Caruso control over the harbor contracts through your son. Not alliance. Control." The word hit Alessio like a match dropped into gasoline. His face did not change, but every guard in the room reached the same conclusion at once. Marco's chair scraped backward. Vivian whispered something sharp in English, and two Caruso men near the south doors shifted toward the exits. Clara saw them before the guards did. "Again, the doors," she said. Alessio did not look away from Marco. "Lock them." The order fell like a blade. Bolts slid. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. Salvatore's signet ring remained on the marble between Clara and the family table, waiting for the old man's final word. The bolts, sliding into place, turned the Bellomo ballroom into a courtroom with chandeliers. No one screamed. That would have been easier. Instead, the rich wives held their glasses in midair. The capos stopped breathing through their teeth, and the Caruso men at the south doors discovered that black-suited Bellomo guards could move faster than fear. The signet ring lay on the marble between Clara Whitaker and Salvatore Bellomo, small enough to fit in a palm, heavy enough to silence an empire. Vivian's face had gone perfectly still, the way beautiful women went still when beauty stopped working. Marco Rinaldi looked at Alessio, then at Salvatore, then finally at Clara, as if only now understanding that the woman he had dismissed as furniture had become the one voice no one could afford to ignore. Alessio did not step in front of her. That was what Clara noticed. He stood at her side, close enough to make every threat think twice, far enough that the words still had to come from her mouth. "Translate it again," Salvatore said. His voice was rough, old, and deadly quiet. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. The room that had laughed at her apron, her size, her place, now waited on her breath. She looked at Vivian first, not with hatred, with the exhausted calm of a woman who had survived 1,000 small cuts and had finally been handed the knife of truth. She used the old table form, Clara said, the one that makes a blessing sound like family consent. But she changed the center words. Not honor. Inherit. Not alliance. Obligation through sons. Not guest. Guarantor. A shudder passed around the table. Salvatore's eyes closed once. When they opened, they were not old. They were Sicily, winter, and judgment. Marco tried to laugh. This is insane. You are letting a waitress rewrite contracts with peasant superstition. Clara turned to him. No, you tried to hide a contract inside a blessing because you thought no one here remembered the language well enough to hear the trap. Marco's mouth shut. Alessio lifted one hand. A guard placed Marco's phone on the table, screen lit with an unsent message to the Caruso men by the doors. No one needed a confession after that. Vivian stepped back, but the velvet rope brushed her spine. There was nowhere elegant left to run. Alessio, she said, softening her voice into silk. You cannot humiliate my family over a serving girl's fantasy. Clara felt the old wound flare, hot and familiar. Serving girl, too large for the room until the room needed her. Too invisible until the truth needed a body. She waited for Alessio to destroy Vivian with one sentence. He could have. Everyone knew it. Instead, he looked at Clara. Do you want me to answer that? The question stunned the room more deeply than any threat. Clara swallowed. Her hands trembled once, then steadied at her sides. No, she said. I want her to hear me. Alessio nodded. Just once. Clara faced Vivian. I serve your table. I heard your lies. I protected his glass when you tried to take it. I translated what you hid. I am not your mistake to erase. Salvatore reached for the crystal glass at last. The same red wine that had frozen in his hand now lifted slowly from the marble. Vivian Caruso, he said, your family has no seat at my table. Marco Rinaldi, your name is removed from Bellomo protection before everyone here. Marco went gray. Vivian's diamonds shook as two guards escorted her back from the table she had believed was already hers. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The same guests who had watched Clara bleed humiliation onto her white apron watched Salvatore slide the signet ring across the marble until it stopped before her. Not to own you, the old man said. To mark that when you speak at this table, Bellomo listens. Clara stared at the ring, then at Alessio. His dark eyes held danger still, but not doubt. Sit, he said the word low and rough. Then, in front of the family, the enemies, the servants, and the women who had looked away, he corrected himself. Please. Clara sat in the chair beside Salvatore, not behind him, not below him, not hidden by a tray. Alessio poured wine into a fresh crystal glass and set it before her with his own hand. Salvatore raised his glass. Every person in the ballroom rose with him. Clara lifted hers last, her stained apron bright under the chandeliers, her large soft body no longer treated as something to shrink from the frame, but as the still center of it. The room went silent again. This time, not because Clara had broken a rule, because everyone was waiting for her to speak.